Okay, so now we're going to get into our final topic on formatting, which is how to properly set up your worksheets in Excel so that when you print them, everything appears fine and they're easy to read. And again, this is something that often gets overlooked when you're first learning how to use Excel and how to format things, but in 90% of all cases, the senior bankers you're working with will want to see everything printed out. They have too much email to deal with. A lot of them don't like working with technology at all, so they don't like to open these big Excel files. They like to see things printed out so they can easily look at them and check them. The other reason that it's important to learn how to print things is for your own purposes, because in a lot of cases you can have a big spreadsheet up on the screen and it's hard to check for errors when it's just on your screen, but usually when you print out something, the errors and mistakes jump out at you quite a bit more. So it's really important to know how to do this, and you should always print out models or valuations or even profiles of companies or research that you put together, just because typically it's much, much easier to find mistakes in the sets of data, especially when it's a big Excel spreadsheet when it's printed out, as opposed to when you're just staring at it on your computer screen. So that's basically why you need to know how to set things up to print, because the senior bankers will often ask you for it, and because when you're checking your own models and you're giving work to other people, you don't want to look like a fool by having mistakes in there. You want to check everything first by printing it out. Now, in terms of how to actually print it, well, before we mentioned that just like any other Windows program, you just press Control P, it brings up the print dialog, whether it's Excel 2003 or Excel 2007. So that's not what we're going to focus on. What we're going to focus on here is how you actually format it for printing. And there are two different key combinations to get to that depending on which version of Excel you're using. In Excel 2003, it's Alt FU. Alt FU to bring up this dialog box. In Excel 2007, the combination is Alt PSP. So Alt PSP brings this dialog box up. And again, in Excel 2003, you get a very similar looking box, except you have to press Alt FU to get to it. This is one of the few cases where the keyboard combinations are actually not compatible between different versions of Excel. So just be careful for that. And remember Alt PSP in 2007 and Alt FU in Excel 2003. So we see that we have a couple different options here. The orientation, portrait and landscape, you're probably familiar with those from other Windows programs and from Word. The adjust to and the fit to are pretty useful here. The adjust to just make sure that the page is the normal size. The fit to is probably the more useful one and the one that you use most often in investment banking. If we press Alt F to get there, well, first off, let's just go back to adjust and we'll press Alt W to go to print preview. And we see the problem here that the first half of this appears on the first page, and then the second half of this, press the down arrow key, appears on the second page right here, which is not ideal because typically when we have a data set like this, we like to have all the columns together on one page, and we just like to have the data scroll throughout pages. So we usually don't like to see it set up like this. So we'll press Escape to get out of the print preview. Then Alt PSP to get back here. And this time we're going to change it to Fit to. So I'll press Alt F, and we'll say 1 page wide by 1 page tall. And this can be whatever you want. You can change this, but be careful when doing it, especially when you have a big data set, because it's very difficult to predict in advance how far down the page it's really going to scroll. So you can do this if you have something really short, but be careful with using this for longer, more extended data sets. But we'll just set that up for now and see what this looks like. Press Alt W to go to print preview. And as you can see, now everything fits on one page like we have it right there. So we'll press Escape to get out of there again. Alt PSP or Alt FU to go back. We'll change that to adjust for now because we actually don't want to do that. So moving on here, let's go to margins next. We can just hit M to move there. And these are very similar to the margins in Word. So I don't think they require too much in the way of explanation, and typically you don't really change these too much. The only exception might be is if you have a case where you absolutely need to change them or make them smaller to fit everything on a page, but typically you don't change the margins too much when you're printing this. The center on the page commands down here, so Alt Z to center horizontally and then Alt V to center vertically, are more useful. And again, I would only recommend using these if you have a relatively small data set, as we do here. If you have something that's pages and pages long, it can be dangerous because you just don't know how it's going to appear. So these can be useful, but I would say they're not used too commonly compared to some of the other commands. Now we'll go back to margins by pressing tab a few times and just go to header, footer. And this is actually pretty useful. What this lets us do is insert our own custom header or our own custom footer. So for example, we'll press Alt-C to go to custom header, and we can call this customer analysis, for example. Press tab to get down to OK. And so that'll now appear as a header when we print this out. This can be really useful for, again, when you have a lot of spreadsheets that you're printing out and it's not immediately obvious that they all belong to one model or to one data set. So this is actually pretty useful and something that you use quite a bit. So get in the habit of inserting headers and footers in your Excel documents. And then for footer, we can press Alt-F to get down there. So sometimes you just list page numbers in the footer. Sometimes you list the current date or further information about it. For now, we can just go with page 1 in the footer. So these are the most commonly used functions within this tab of the page setup. And then we can press tab a few more times, and then go over to sheet with S. And this probably has the most useful functions of the entire page setup dialog for printing out Excel worksheets. So the print area is probably the most useful thing on here. We'll press Alt-A to get to that, or we can just press Tab. And to set the print area, I'll just move this with the mouse so you can see what I'm doing. The print area is useful to set because we can tell Excel exactly what we want it to print, which means, and I'm just using Control-Shift and the down arrow keys here. And this means that when we go to print it out, we can actually fit it more exactly to the specific area that we're looking for. So this is something that you actually use all the time within Excel when you're printing documents. So I'd strongly recommend getting used to this and getting some practice with this. Now, the other useful feature here is the repeat rows and columns. So I'll press Alt-R to go to that, press the arrow key to get back on the spreadsheet, and I can press the Shift spacebar key to highlight this whole first row. Now, this is very useful when you have data scrolling across 50 pages, for example, and you need to maintain that one row at the top so you can easily look at it and tell what data belongs to which category. So repeating rows is done all the time. Repeating columns is not quite as common because typically your data is going to extend many rows as opposed to many columns, but nevertheless, it is there in case you wanted to use it. And then you have all these other options. You can display grid lines. It can be in black and white. You can display headings, comments, but I would say these are probably the most common ones to show. This one here, cell errors, this is actually a pretty interesting option. And what I would say here is when you're printing out your model or your data set or whatever it is you're working on to check it for your own purposes, you definitely want to have these displayed to catch any mistakes. But if you're handing this into a senior banker or someone else on your team, it's probably better to leave these blank so they don't see it in case there is actually an error on your spreadsheet for whatever reason. Then page order, this can also be useful, especially when you're printing out a document that's 50 or 100 pages or something like that. So now that we have all that set up, let's press Alt-W here and go to Print Preview. And this gives us a preview of what it's going to look like. And we'll just zoom in now. And we can see that we have this header in the top right here. Everything fits on one page because we changed it and we changed the print area. And then moving to the bottom, we see that this page 1 is down here at the bottom. So everything looks as intended. And now we can just press Escape to get out of this. So those are some of the more common functions that you use when printing documents. And just to review that, Alt-FU to get in Excel 2003, Alt-PSP in Excel 2007. I would say the most common functions are the scaling thing right here. You actually use that pretty frequently if you're trying to fit everything on one page. The orientation can be used frequently as well. Margins are not used too much. Header, footer, you actually use this quite a lot to make your own custom headers and footers and to give page numbers and dates. And then sheet, you change the print area all the time. So this one's actually pretty common, and you should get used to doing it because it lets you get a lot more precise with what you actually want to be printed out in your files. And for example, if you have lots of input data or lots of other irrelevant fields, it lets you exclude those. Repeat rows is used all the time, so is repeat columns. I would say those are the most important and most useful ones to get to know within Excel. So just keep those in mind. And then before you print anything out ever, always go to Alt-W for print preview. So Alt-FU to go to page setup in Excel 2003 and then Alt-FV to get to print preview. Always go to print preview first to double check yourself and make sure everything looks okay before you print it. Okay, so now that we've done that, what I want you to do is to go through and do exactly what I just did now. And just to review what I did, go to the print dialog, and I changed it to a landscape. Then I went over to header footer. I added this header right here, customer analysis. Then I added this footer at the bottom for the page number. And then I went over to sheet and I set the print area to A1 through L22, basically our area of Excel that we've actually filled out in this worksheet. And then I set the repeat rows to the first row. So I want you to go into your own file right now and do all that. And then once you've done that, just unpause this video, and then I'll walk through it and give you all the shortcuts this time around. Okay, good. So here's the original worksheet that we started with, and now I'm going to show you how to set this up so that the headers and footers appear properly and so that everything else is adjusted. So to access the page setup dialog, it's either Alt-FU in Excel 2003 or Alt-PSP in Excel 2007. Okay, so we see it's already by default set to landscape, but we could press Alt-L to get to that if we're not set to that, and similarly Alt-T to get to portrait. Then to go over to margins, press M. We're just going to skip everything there. We're not changing anything here. Then we'll press H to get to header footer. For header, we'll just enter Alt-C to get to custom header. We'll call this customer analysis. Just type that. Press Tab, Tab again, and then Tab again to get to OK. Press Enter. Then for footer, press Alt-F, and we're just going to go down to the first one, page 1, with the down arrow key. Then we'll press Tab a few more times here. And back at the top, we can press S to get over to the sheet. For the print area, we'll press Alt-A to get to this. Then we'll press the right arrow key to go onto the sheet itself. Go to the top left cell, press Control-Shift, down arrow key, and then right to get that whole area selected. And then for the rows to repeat at the top, I press Alt-R, go to the first row, and press Shift Spacebar to select it. And that's pretty much it. So we'll press Alt-W now to go to print preview. And we can see here that it's still not quite correct. What we need to do now is actually go in and fix this so that it appears on one page. Let's go back to page setup over here. Press P to get over to page. And we'll press Alt-F to use Fit To right here. Press OK. And now we see that it works. And again, be careful with using Fit To. It works in this case, but generally you want to avoid using it for most large data sets because it can create dangerous situations where you try to fit 500 pages on one sheet, for example, but it is okay to use here. And so that's the basics of how we go through and set up files for printing in Excel. Again, very important. Don't overlook this because you'll have to do this all the time. This is one area where the more you play around with it and the more you experiment, you'll find different tricks and different things that are useful. These are really just the basics that I covered now, but this is what you have to do most of the time, setting up custom headers, footers, changing the print area, repeating rows, and things of that nature. So those are the important concepts to keep in mind for this. And with that done, that takes us to the conclusion of our formatting tutorials. And next up, we're going to go into formulas, and then we'll be getting into more advanced material after that.